I'm going to talk about the erosion of academic freedom in Venezuela from a comparative analysis of threats across the Americas. It is a honor for me to share with you some of the insights gained from academic research, as Elizabeth mentioned, combined with the work of Aula Abierta. In English, the name is Open Class, an NGO with ECOSOC consultative status as civil society organization before the United Nations, dedicated to the defense and promotion of academic freedom in Latin America. What do we aim to achieve at this lecture? I'm trying to move the, yeah. Can you see the second slide? Good. We aim to analyze the situation of academic freedom and autonomy within higher education institutions in Venezuela, identifying primary restrictions, reprisals, threats, and challenges in Venezuela. The analysis will be grounded in international human rights standards with a specific focus on the inter-American principles of academic freedom and university autonomy, which were published by the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights in 2021 in December. As I told you, our aim is to combine some experiences from the academic sphere with those derived from human rights activism. We at Aula Abierta navigate the intersection of two principal environments, the academic spheres and human rights activism as civil society actors. In relation to some insights regarding Aula Abierta's work, first, it's important to say that Aula Abierta began its efforts in Venezuela and subsequently expanded across Latin America. We began documenting and monitoring the situation of academic freedom and the human rights of the members of university communities in Venezuela in the context of the repression in 2014. And also we had a peak of repression, unfortunately, in 2017. But after that, in 2018, in Nicaragua, we began to see similar patterns of violation of academic freedom in terms of the criminalization of students, repression, reprisals, arbitrary detention, and we expanded our focus on Nicaragua and after that on Latin America. In the case of Cuba, we began in 2020 to see the systematic practices against the critical thinking in the context of protests since the month of July, and the practices of indoctrination within universities with the purpose of developing an unique thought. But also in Brazil, when Bolsonaro reached to the power in 2020, 2021, 22, we began to monitor some restrictions on university budgets, discrimination, reprisals against university actors. In Colombia, in the context of the protest of 2021, we prepared some reports and we were very focused on the cases of gender violence within universities in Colombia. In March of 2022, the Colombian Ministry of Education reported 876 cases of sexual harassment Of these, 65 resulted in sanctions, 127 were closed, and 684 remain under investigation. There is a significant underreporting of gender-based violence cases in Colombia, and because of that, we were very focused on that issue. We also attend to cases very important for the subject of the violence, gender violence within the universities in Colombia, the cases of the Professor Mónica Godoy Ferro before the Constitutional Chamber in Colombia. In one of those cases, we submitted an amicus curiae to the Constitutional Chamber in Colombia. I recommend to study those case law from the Constitutional Chamber in Colombia because they are really important as reference of the topic of gender violence inside the universities. Aula Abierta has produced reports with a Latin American focus on issues such as budgetary restrictions against universities, the impact of the pandemic, for example, on university students, repression against students and also professors in protest and demonstrations contexts, the critical situation of libraries and laboratories, and interventionism against autonomous universities. We prepared in 2023 a report on the situation of academic freedom in the Americas with a regional perspective. We began to recognize that in Latin America, we were confronting multiple violations against human rights, academic freedom that requires enhanced recognition under international law. And that was our request every time we had a meeting before international human rights bodies from the Inter-American system and also from the United Nations. We also observed that in Latin American contexts, academic freedom is violated not only in authoritarian regimes, such as Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, for example, but also in democratic societies. Regarding the path toward Inter-American principles on academic freedom, it's important to share with you a brief comment. Between 2018 and 2021, Aula Abierta, along with human rights bodies from different universities in Latin America, in Venezuela, and other spaces, even in North America, contributed to the development of the Inter-American principles on academic freedom and autonomy of the universities through the specialized academic network before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. This involvement included submitting draft principles, participating in several sessions and hearings before the Inter-American Commission, organizing discussions and debates, conferences, events, and conducting several working meetings. In this context, first of all, it is crucial to clarify the scope of the academic freedom concept used by Aula Abierta, NGO, which emphasizes its nature as a human right intrinsically linked to the idea of democracy and development. This definition considers as protected subjects not only individuals, professors, researchers, students within universities involved in scientific knowledge production and academic debate, but also those engaged in an academic role of social leadership within and outside the institution. The institution, the university per se, are under protection as well as institution by the right to academic freedom. Academic freedom, as established by the Inter-American principles, is a human right, fundamentally linked to the very notion of democracy and development. Like freedom of expression, for example, it possesses both an individual and collective dimension. Consequently, violations of academic freedom can impact the very foundation of democracy. Aula Abierta has concluded that university actors in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba face a systematic violation of academic freedom, which is a direct consequence of the reduction of civic space and democratic erosion. The situation of academic freedom in Venezuela is fundamentally very similar to that of Cuba and Nicaragua, as I said, although, of course, there are important differences. In all three cases, we are facing authoritarian regimes whose governments target critical academics, professors, for example, and students who produce critical knowledge or participate in critical debate. In other words, the first conclusion I want to highlight is that critical academics in authoritarian contexts are subjects who require special protection because they present a condition of particular vulnerability and are at risk from these authoritarian regimes. This thesis has been developed by Aula Abierta in various reports. For example, in our report on the situation of academic freedom in the Americas, published in 2023, which was cited by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education in 2024. Our report emphasized that critical academics are subjects with special vulnerability in authoritarian contexts. Consequently, we were able to conclude that critical university actors require international protection due to their confrontation with authoritarian regimes. Nonetheless, the situation in other states, such as Argentina or the United States, currently today, is also a serious concern. I wish to emphasize on a crucial point. Our analysis pertains exclusively to human rights violations, not to ideological disputes. I said that because in our reports we denounce the violation of academic freedom independently if it came by a government who aligns itself as a right-wing or left-wing government. I would like to share a few examples to further illustrate my point. During the 2020 pandemic, academics from the Venezuelan Academy of Physical, Mathematical, and Natural Sciences in Venezuela were threatened with the Operation Tuntun. Tuntun means knock the door of the enemies. After publishing a report that warned of a potential surge in COVID cases in the country. Similarly, in Nicaragua, the directors of the Health Research Center at UNAM Managua were dismissed after their director issued statements expressing concerns regarding the country's pandemic management. Imagine the head of a health university center was dismissed when he declared about some concerns on the pandemic. In both cases, the victims of violations of academic freedom and other human rights, of course, were not solely the academics themselves. Venezuelan and Nicaraguan society was also subjected to restrictions that undermined the right to information, public health, and democracy, among others. This is an example of the enabling role of academic freedom and its intersection with other human rights. In 2017, in Venezuela, Professor Santiago Guevara was imprisoned and prosecuted in military courts after publishing an article criticizing Hugo Chávez's economic model. His research was used by the prosecutor's office as evidence of his crime. In another case in Venezuela, Professor Rocío San Miguel, a human rights defender and university professor as well, she is an expert in military and national security issues and a human rights defender, as I mentioned, has been detained since February of last year. I want to emphasize that the Attorney General asserted that the country maps with the determination of the strategic zones, military strategic zones, and other content related to her academic expertise were evidence of her crimes. She was professor just in these topics. In 2019, when the electrical crisis in Venezuela reached its most critical point, we organized a conference at the University of Zulia, where I teach, to address the main problems of public services in the city of Maracaibo, where I live. Obviously, the audience, including me, I am lawyer, need to listen the explanations from the electrical engineering professors, but unfortunately, they all decline due to fear of reprisals from the government, as some colleagues who had spoken out had been persecuted. Self-censorship. These examples are useful to illustrate that academic freedom undoubtedly has an inherent relationship with democracy. Moreover, as stated in the Inter-American Principles on Academic Freedom and University Autonomy, it is an autonomous, interdependent, and enable human right. The example of the report by the Academy of Physical and Mathematical and Natural Sciences demonstrate the relationship between academic freedom and the right to public health, for example. Similarly, the example of professors' self-censorship when discussing the problems in the electrical system shows how a society can be inhibited from knowing a situation of such important general interest from the direct voice of academic experts. In sum, in Venezuela, over the past 2 decades, we have witnessed the configuration of a state policy against academic freedom and against universities through the implementation of several practices and patterns systematically repeated against academics, professors, and students, and against universities as institutions, as centers of scientific knowledge production. In this context, to proceed directly to the topic on the erosion of academic freedom in Venezuela, we will analyze 3 key components as follows. First, we will examine the legislative and institutional framework in Venezuela, and we will assess its compatibility with international standards on academic freedom and human rights. We will identify some restrictions against academic freedom in domestic law in Venezuela, which are incompatible with international standards. We call those indicators structural indicators when we produce our reports. The second We will analyze some practices from the branches of public power in Venezuela, executive, judiciary, legislative, and how they restrict academic freedom. The analysis will highlight the restrictive policies, practices, and patterns against academic freedom and university autonomy in Venezuela, for example, regarding budgetary strangulation of universities, criminalization of competencies, criminalization of protests, and discrimination against professors and students, the usurpation of competencies of public autonomous universities by ministerial authorities, the judicial siege against universities through the case law. We will analyze some generalized practices on the intervention of higher education institutions, among others. And three, we will analyze the situation, which has been further exacerbated by the complex humanitarian emergency in Venezuela, which profoundly affects the university as a critical institution for democracy and its key stakeholders, professors, researchers, and students. We will comprehensively explore these challenges and their implications, for example, on the right to quality education and other human rights. And we will conclude, according to our experience documenting situation of academic freedom in Venezuela and Latin America, we identify some challenges on the effective implementation of the Inter-American principles on academic freedom and autonomy of the universities in Latin America. Regarding the regulatory framework, I mean the first point, domestic law, we will examine the legislative and institutional framework in Venezuela and assess its compatibility with international standards on academic freedom and human rights. I mentioned that in the reports we use to identify these indicators as structural ones. As sources of international and inter-American law, it's important to say that we recognize the relevant international standards contained in the subject within the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 19, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 13, among others, the American Convention on Human Rights, Article 13, among others, and the Protocol of San Salvador concerning the attributes of the right to education, for example. Additionally, we consider General Comments number 13 on the right to education and the one number 25 on science and economic, social, and cultural rights, both produced by the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as well as the Inter-American Principles, of course, on academic freedom and university autonomy. Furthermore, it is important to mention that in 2020, the United Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, it was first David Cale, but just the report was prepared by David Cale, but was presented by Irene Khan, produced a report concerning academic freedom and freedom of expression. Subsequently, it's important to say that in 2024, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education issued a report focusing on academic freedom and the right to education. Also, it is important to mention that the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and its rapporteurs on freedom of expression, RELE, and on economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights, REDESCA, annually delineate their reports focusing on the status of academic freedom and the situation of university members as actors subject to special protection, especially before authoritarian regimes. This focused approach by the Inter-American Commission, which prioritized academic freedom as a human rights, represents a significant achievement resulting from the international advocacy work conducted by Aula Abierta and other organizations that have collaborated across the Americas to increase the visibility of the academic freedom situation in the region. The situation of academic freedom and autonomy of higher education institutions in Venezuela regarding the regulatory domestic law is complex because although academic freedom is legally and constitutionally recognized, it has been restricted since the early 2000s through a policy developed by the National Executive Branch that limits and regulates the freedom of education and thought. Former President Hugo Chavez endorsed the idea of the consolidation of socialism of this century, and consequently, the new university became a political and indoctrination echo chamber rather than an scenario for the free discussion of ideas. It was the concept imposed. The right to education and academic freedom and university autonomy are recognized in several articles of the Constitution and also in the University Law Act. This framework is consistent with articles of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and also International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and also with the UNESCO recommendation concerning the status of higher education teaching personnel, among others. However, the organic law of education states the concept of Estado docente, the teaching state, which assigns to the national executive power competences of controlling over universities, rules and policies of government, income, training, which according to the executive power must be subordinated to the consolidation of the ideology of the socialism. Since that the executive power control many autonomous competences of the universities regarding the developing of plans, investment, research, scientific exchange, academic programs, training, curriculum, the plan of student admissions. The students in public universities in Venezuela are decided to be admitted in any university in an office inside the ministry in Caracas. The election system of the authorities, I mean presidents, deans, etc., of the universities, etc. Maybe later we can talk a bit more about it. In 2003, it was imposed a parallel system of higher education subordinated to the state under the name of Sucre Mission, which absorbed all universities lacking autonomous status, where the state has created a pensée unique university model, a single thought university model. And it's very important to talk a bit about the plan of the Homeland 2013 to 2019 and the following ones. This is a state policy paper which was enforced as law, and it stated the university transformation, subordinating it, or the universities, to the radicalization of the revolution under the Bolivarian socialism. It established that scientific research should serve to the construction of a socialist production through the socialist ethics. In Venezuela, there has been a recent proliferation of laws that impose limitations on the civic sphere, such as the Simon Bolivar law and the so-called anti-NGO law for the regulation and oversight civil society organizations. Both state serious threats to academic freedom. This is due to the presence of ambiguous and discretionary norms that could potentially assimilate academic research or critical scientific knowledge as illicit acts prosecutable by the state. While the law on the oversight and financing NGOs, the anti-NGOs law, is viewed by civil society organizations as a tool for legal and financial strangulation, the Simón Bolívar law grants the state extensive powers to control the economy and restrict the autonomy of independent actors. Experts caution that both legislative instruments form part of an apparatus of control now being utilized to criminalize individuals who publicly denounce Venezuela's institutional humanitarian crisis, human rights violations, the absence of democracy, etc. In conjunction with these two laws, the Simón Bolívar and anti-NGOs law, among others, such as the national security law or the law against hate for intolerance and peaceful coexistence, the government, based on the existence of alleged internal and external threats to the country, criminalize actions carried out by civil society, including university scholars and critical students, non-governmental organizations, human rights defenders, peaceful protesters, journalists, and opposition political parties who are understood as alleged enemies of the nation and agents destabilizing peace, the doctrine of the enemy. Regarding the patterns, the second point, the patterns and practices restricting academic freedom, we will summarize some practices from the branches of public power in Venezuela and how they restrict academic freedom through several key mechanisms, such as budgetary strangulation of universities, criminalization of protests and discrimination against professors and students, the usurpation of competences of public autonomous universities by ministerial authorities, the judicial siege against universities, among others. Aula Abierta has published several reports and denunciations on these topics, some of which have been cited by international bodies, such as the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the special rapporteurs from the United Nations and the Inter-American Commission, etc. Recently, Aula Abierta produced a report on the stigmatization of university members as terrorists, which talk about forced disappearance, arbitrary detention, harassment, targeting members of the academic community due to their participation in the discussion of public affairs in Venezuela. The report was focused in the time in January to October of this year, so it is very recent, which identify as its main findings that I'm going to share with you some recurring patterns of violations as the ones that you can read in the slide. For example, regarding the situation of human rights defenders and university professors who are concurrently university faculty and human rights defenders, we have the cases of Professor Javier Tarazona, director of an NGO, Professor Rocío San Miguel, director of an NGO, but they are also human rights defenders. The situation of Eduardo Torres, researcher at the Central University of Venezuela, and also human rights defender, among other cases. Members of the Venezuelan academic community has been victims of several violations in the period of time that the report considered this year, have been victims of reprisals for engaging in several activities, using their expertise to critique the state's economic policies. This is a current problem, investigating and addressing human rights violations, critical, mobilizing university community members, and generally for participating in the discussion of public affairs. Furthermore, the practice of labeling the affected university members as terrorists was once again identified in this report, in this instance by the Minister of Interior and Justice, Diosdado Cabello. On May 28, some months ago, he declared in an address on national television that academics in Venezuela are terrorists. The report concludes that these reprisals are the result of a state policy designed to criminalize the participation of students, faculty, and members of the university community in the discussion of Venezuelan public affairs. Regarding the judicialization and repression directed against students, faculty, and researchers who have sought to participate in the discussion of public affairs through their academic expertise, the impact of this practice can be quantified, given, said the report, that 6 of the 18 university members detained were designated as terrorists and or prosecuted before courts with jurisdiction over the matter. This represents the 34% of the detained university members who were stigmatized as terrorists. Just to illustrate this point with some data, I would like to cite several paragraphs from these reports. At least 22 individuals who direct academic ties were detained or harassed. These individuals include 9 university faculty members, 5 students, 2 university affiliate workers, and a human rights defender, 1 researcher, 1 student federation representative, and 1 student association leader representative. One incident involved acts of intimidation against the family members of a professor in exile, which constitutes an act of transnational repression. It was mentioned by the last report of the situation of the fact-finding mission presented before the Human Rights Council in the United Nations last month. The 19 university members detained were indicted and prosecuted before courts with jurisdiction over terrorism, meaning a total of 37% of the university members were stigmatized as terrorists. Furthermore, 10 of the 19 detainees were victims of enforced disappearance, accounting for a percentage such as 52%. These university members have been subjected to reprisals for engaging in the following activities: critiquing the state's economic policies based on their expertise, investigating and addressing human rights violations, critically mobilizing members of the university community because they are leaders, and generally participating in the discussion of public affairs. These reprisals represent an addition to those documented since the 2024 presidential elections last year. Of the 35 university members detained between July and December of last year, 7 were indicted and prosecuted as terrorists. constituting a 20% of the university members who face this stigmatization. Comparing 2024 with this year, present year, a notable increase in university members stigmatized as terrorists is evident, rising from the 20% in 2024 to an almost 40% in 2025. Finally, by way of summary, Aula Abierta has documented 95 incidents of reprisals against university faculty and students within the context of the electoral processes between July 2024 and October 2025. These incidents include 54 citizens detained, 40 harassed, and the annulment of one university lecturer passports. This is a new pattern that we are documenting the annulation of the passports as Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua does. The detentions and harassments directed against the different members of the community, academic community that are mentioned in the slide, all of whom possess significant ties to the academic community and activism, are manifestations of a state policy of repression that reaffirms the vulnerable status of university community members in Venezuela. The continuation of the practice of labeling affected university members as terrorists was identified, reflecting an stigmatization policy by public authorities wherein university actors are viewed as enemies of the state. This policy has been articulated in this instance by one of the highest authorities in public administration, Diosdado Cabello, the Minister of Interior and Justice. Concurrently, Aula Abierta determined that 7 of the 18 university members detained were indicted and prosecuted before courts with jurisdiction over terrorism, totaling 39% of university members stigmatized as terrorists. These events reinforce the condition of specific vulnerability of university community, and we can give an example. It's the same doctrine that the one used for understand the specific vulnerability, for example, that the human rights defender has, or the journalists, especially when they are publishing critical communication products criticizing, for example, the government or authoritarian regimes. And I would like to conclude this point with this idea: the specific targeting of individuals with academic profiles underscores an attempt to minimize the influence that the university and its community can exert on the construction of a critical public consciousness and the civic space. The objective is to try to neutralize the impact that the universities can produce in a society, producing critical scientific knowledge and leading the critic debate in a society. Regarding the budgetary constraints on Venezuelan public universities, it's important to say that even before 2010, Venezuela has implemented a state policy aimed at creating a budgetary strangulation of its public universities. More critically, for the year 2020, the Ministry of People's Power for University Education disproportionately disregarded the budget proposal submitted by the universities. It approved allocations suffering from a deficit that in some cases reached nearly the 98% of the institution's actual requirements. I mean, the only budget assigned was between 1% to 3, 4, 5%, depending on the cases, but the deficit was even higher than the 90%. By 2023, some of the nation's most prominent universities reported an alarming overall deficit exceeding the 97% the deficit. This practice of budgetary strangulation has precipitated a series of negative impacts on access to quality education. For example, during 2022 and 2023, student dropout rates persisted due to the material impossibility for university students to access to quality distance education. The percentage decrease in enrollment across Venezuelans' main public universities ranges between 40% to 60% of dropout, for example, of students. Regarding the judicial siege against university, since 2010, more than 50 judgments from judiciary have been registered by Aula Abierta and other organizations which directly violate the content of academic freedom, university autonomy, and other human rights. In cases related to electoral processes within universities, the elections in universities have been systematically cancelled, suspended by the judicial power and other authorities. The only exception is the Central University of Venezuela 2 years ago. Regarding case law, selection of professors and university authorities, for example, student admissions, among other topics. Particular attention was drawn to a denunciation by several NGOs and the university human rights centers who publicly disclosed the Twitter profile, the ex profile in that time Twitter, of the judge presiding over certain cases involving the University of Los Andes, La ULA. The Twitter profile said that the judge self-identifies as a soldier of the socialist revolution. Regarding the criminalization of protest and discrimination against professors and students, Aula Abierta has documented numerous denunciations concerning cases of criminalization of protest, persecution, arbitrary detention, targeting faculty and students. Perhaps the denunciation that received the most attention from international bodies was the one submitted in the context of the brutal repression of 2017 against strict demonstrations in Venezuela, in which university students were particularly active. I quote that denounce during 2017, 21 invasions from police and military forces into universities' campuses were documented. Indeed, this pattern was called the attention of international bodies because they didn't understand how police could intercept and invade, erupt inside the universities and destroy the buildings of the universities. 17 universities scholars and 339 university students were arbitrarily detained, and university scholars as well as student dropouts have been calculated ranging from 30 to 50% in the same year. As patterns identified, we can summarize attacks on campuses by state security forces and also irregular groups supported by the state official forces, selective detention of university professors and students, and the application, among others, of the military justice in contravention to international standards and also constitutional domestic law. Furthermore, 92 demonstrations convened by the academic community were suppressed. The main repressive body was the Bolivarian National Guard, the military force, being responsible for the 82% of the demonstrations. Allegations of raids on the campus were received without any warrant or justification based on the exceptional situations declared or notified in advance according to national and international standards, and 21 attacks or break-ins in campuses between April and July of 2017. Regarding the discriminatory practices in the higher education system, it's important to say that discrimination in the higher education system has been increasing in Venezuela in recent years. The following denunciation was presented by Aula Abierta during an international hearing in 2017. This one generated significant interest among the commissioners of the Inter-American Commission. I'm going to quote, between June 21st and July 3rd of 2016, 896 students from the state of Zulia, where I live, were temporarily suspended from the government's Jesus Enrique Lozada Scholarship Program. It's a scholarship that the governor sponsors. It was within the context of the process of collecting signatures in favor of the activation of the recall referendum against President Nicolás Maduro. Such disincorporation was related to actions and practices of reprisals and political discrimination exercised by the former governor of Zulia State, who was a political ally of the national government. I mean, he used the scholarship as an electoral tool. On September of 2017, complaints were received denouncing that the governor of Zulia State coerced students to subscribe to voter registration forms in favor of his candidacy to the regional elections process of October 2017. This denounce was of particular interest of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in that hearing. Aula Abierta has documented several cases of retaliatory actions against students or professors for having manifested some criticisms against the national government or belonging to some political opposition grouping. In all cases, the violation of due process has been reiterated. The last point to talk about, I want to be very focused on this, is regarding the complex humanitarian emergency in Venezuela and threats to educational quality. The situation has been further exacerbated by the complex humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, which profoundly affects the university as a critical institution for democracy and its key stakeholders, professors, researchers, and students. We will comprehensively explore some challenges and implications. A state policy exists in Venezuela designated to violate the freedom of association of university professors. I'm going to summarize the situation. The Federation of University Professors, FAPUP, along with the faculty associations from the country's main public universities, have been systematically excluded from collective discussions and other forums concerning their rights and interests. This exclusion functions as a mechanism of retaliation for their critical opinions against state policies that undermine university autonomy, freedom of association, academic freedom, and human rights of the university actors. Consequently, of this exclusion of the natural legitimate representative of the professor, university professors in Venezuela currently experience extreme poverty due to their salary situation. Their monthly earnings amount is approximately of $1 to $4 per month, depending the ranking of the professors, which falls significantly below the United Nations established international poverty line, which is of the $3 per day. So a university professor in Venezuela receives $1 to $4, depending the rank, per month, while the extreme poverty line is $3 per day. In the slide, you can see a tweet and post in X, social media, published 2 months ago by the FAPUP, the Federation of Professors in Venezuela, that says with remuneration oscillating between $1 to $4, maybe it was important to say per month, it is impossible to guarantee a replacement generation of faculty. The exodus of our colleagues cannot be contained, resulting in a significant loss of academics for the country. Brain drain. University personnel demand an immediate salary increase. And in this charter, you can see the publication of the APUCB, the Association of Professors of the Central University of Venezuela, which indicates the amount of the salary per month. So the best ranked university professor received $4, the equivalent in bolivars, our local currency, for the equivalent of $4 per month. In my case, for example, I am associated professor at University of Zulia State, the second biggest public university in Venezuela. My salary per month is around $2 per month. And in the second column, you can see in Spanish, sorry for that, but it was the official charter, the dedication. DE is exclusive dedication. TC means tiempo completo, I mean full time. AMT medium time, half time in the dedication. So the Aula Abierta's report about situation of academicians in the context of the complex humanitarian emergency in Venezuela highlighted the situation of budgetary asphyxia from the government, the collapse of student services, the lack of support for scientific research, the massive violation of the labor and health rights of university professors, among other problems, which entail serious consequences in the exercise of academic freedom, university autonomy, and consequently the right to quality education. We have documented as well the alarming professors and students dropout rates, especially in the past years. The forced migration of Venezuelans, as you know, has been very, very concerning, and some ideas about it to have an idea of the general context. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2018 stated he was deeply disturbed by the growing exodus of Venezuelans, many of them seeking access to food and basic services. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has identified the forced migration of Venezuelans as one of the largest population outflow in the region since the creation of the High Commissioner for Refugees in 1950, the biggest and the largest outflow of people in the region. The Inter-American Commission in 2018 produced the resolution 218, which considers that there are massive violations of human rights in Venezuela and a serious crisis as a result of shortage of food and medicines, causing an exponential growth of hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans who have been forced to migrate to other countries within the region as a survival strategy. And it is important to say that the amount of Venezuelans who force migrate the country is around 8.5 millions of Venezuelans. It is almost the 25% of the population. In relation to the alarming emigration of highly remarkable Venezuelan professors and students and the brain drain in Venezuela, some human rights organizations have denounced that due to the precarious salary conditions, university professors who are highly skilled professionals with great experience are emigrating from Venezuela in search of job opportunities abroad. And this is a point that I would like to highlight because this kind of conferences can make rise awareness of the situation. And one of the difficulties that the university in Venezuela has today is to make international academic exchange. And this opportunity is for sure an occasion to do that and to connect with academicians in other contexts. According to a survey carried out by Aula Abierta on the situation of university professors, the 85% of professors affirm that they had thought about migrating to another country due to the salary situation they suffer in Venezuela, and they confess that they live working in other fields and areas apart of the academic work, which work is a volunteer work because they cannot live with the salary of one in current situation, $1 to $4 per month. In Venezuela, to live, a minimum family requires between $500 to $600 per month. And so a university professor receives $1 to $4 per month. In relation to the existence of a high percentage of students drop out, between 2011 and 2016, rates have ranged from 10% to 30% of the total student population. However, in 2017 to 2018, maybe the peak in the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, figures have increased considerably since the allocation of the quotas of public universities in the country has been centralized in the Office of Planning of the University Sector, OPSU. That's the office in Caracas that decides the admissions of all the students in all the public universities in the country. There are some comments, but we don't have time, at least now, contravening higher education institutional autonomy. According to different university human rights institutes, the percentage of student dropout in University of Oriente, University of Zulia, where I teach, University of Los Andes, and Central University of Venezuela ranges between 30 to 60% in 2018. There is a final comment that I want to say regarding the inaccessibility to internet, electricity, and communication services. In relation to these limitations of internet access, during 2017, the systematic and accelerated deterioration of internet and telephone service in Venezuela was really concerning. Venezuela was identified as the country with the lowest access to internet connection with a speed of 1.9 megabits. I'm not very familiar to that words. The internet service in universities is low and intermittent. And the universities has the problem that they suffer, especially in the past years, situation of criminality, and they were stolen the infrastructure, the electricity cables, the equipments, because they were many of them were closed because of the situation. Therefore, the right to receive a quality education is violated. University students are also affected by the crisis that has extended over other services like public transportation, shortage of cash flow. We didn't have cash in Venezuela, and now the current cash on the streets is the dollar bills, and has also severely limited internet access. And of course, universities in general suffer this situation. To conclude, regarding some challenges for implementing the Inter-American principles on academic freedom and university autonomy in the context of authoritarianisms and fragile democracies. According to the Academic Freedom Index, this freedom, academic freedom, has declined over the last decade in 22 countries, which collectively are home to more than half of the world's population. This problem appears to be directly related to the growing authoritarian trends widely observed across the globe in recent years. Indeed, universities seem to be a primary target for the authoritarian leaders, who increasingly resort to populist attacks against higher education, the takeover of institutions by political allies, and the repression of on-campus student protests as tools to serve their political agendas. In the Americas, besides Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, we are very concerned about the situation in United States and Argentina, for example, but also we have documented different situations in Brazil, Mexico, and other spaces with restrictive practices against academic freedom. The Inter-American principles are intended to reverse this anti-democratic trend and protect the vital role played by higher education institutions. The principles adopt global standards on academic freedom and tailor them to the needs of the region. Specifically, they underscores the duty of states, institutional actors, and societies to ensure that academics, students, and the entire university community are free to think, research, and share ideas. In turn, the principles emphasize that universities are free and autonomous spaces capable of fostering social and scientific progress and modeling democratic participation. In the Americas, the recognition of academic freedom within national legal framework is an outstanding debt. It is fully necessary. Only 7 of the 35 members states of the Organization of American States, OAS, a mere 20% explicitly provide protection in domestic law for academic freedom in their legislation. 6 of these countries do so in general and or special laws when only Ecuador grants its constitutional recognition. It's the only country in the Americas that mention the category academic freedom in the Constitution. With regard to university autonomy, 15 of the 35 OAS member states, I mean the 43% recognize the institutional autonomy at the constitutional level, 15. It's furthermore 19 states, I mean the 65% recognize it in general or in special laws. The recognition of the autonomy of the universities is higher than the recognition of the academic freedom as human right. So to finish, it is imperative to advance toward a level of full constitutional and legal recognition in domestic laws for both academic freedom and university autonomy in the region. Without university, without academic freedom and other human rights, it's impossible to achieve democracy and development. Thank you very much.